Trump is trying to remake the United Nations. Members of the Trump administration have said that the U.S. President Donald Trump believes the United Nations should refocus on its founding purpose, quote unquote, of preserving international peace and security. It's not clear what the administration's appeal to the UN original ideal means in policy terms. Even the world's organization's proponents agree that after debilitating debates over the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, the Secretary General and the overall UN system are in a bad state. The administration has emphasized what it does not like about the UN, quitting or defunding multilateral arrangements on issues ranging from health to human rights. It has also announced a full review of all U.S. multilateral commitments and treaties, which include the UN Charter. But Washington has offered little detail about what Trump's vision of a peace-focused UN would look like. Last week, Washington nonetheless gave a pretty strong hint about how it sees the UN as a potential vehicle for framing big power deal-making and sidelining smaller states. It showed its hand on the third anniversary of Russia's all-out aggression in Ukraine. Kiev and its European allies aim to mark this with a UN General Assembly resolution that condemned Moscow and reaffirmed Ukraine's territorial integrity. The previous administration, under former President Joe Biden, had lobbied for similar texts. Members of the Trump administration said that the U.S. President Donald Trump believes the United Nations should refocus on its founding purpose of preserving international peace and security. It's not clear what the administration appeal to the UN original deal means. Now, last week, nevertheless, Washington gave a pretty strong hint about how it sees the UN as a potential vehicle in line with its policies of reconciliation with Moscow. By contrast, Trump's team pressed Ukraine to withdraw its text, which President Zelensky refused to do, and tabled resolutions of its own in both the General Assembly and Security Council that dispensed with all criticism of Russia, made no mention of Ukraine's sovereign rights as a UN member, and called for a rapid peace deal. China and Russia joined the United States to vote through the Security Council version of the text, although the United Kingdom, France, and 3 other European members of the body abstained on it. The Europeans had more luck inserting references to Ukraine's basic rights into the General Assembly version. It was not only a break in the Biden administration's approach to the UN, but also the basic pattern of UN policies in the post-Cold War era. France and the UK and the United States have always had their differences in New York, most painfully over Iraq in 2003, and most recently over Gaza, but they've usually hung together on the most important votes. By contrast, China and Russia have coordinated increasingly closely in recent years, even if Chinese officials are usually less assertive than their counterparts. Russian officials have long felt that the United States has not treated them with the respect they deserve as a major power and a veto wielder in the Security Council. In trying to forge a compromise with Russia last week, Trump administration arguably did pay homage to the founding logic of the UN system for all its lip service to sovereign equality. The World Organization is by design hierarchical. It invests in high level of institutional authority and a small clique of major powers. Former President Franklin D. Roosevelt planned for the UN during World War II, imagining that the United States, Russia, the UK, and China would use the Security Council as a framework to police the world. France was belatedly added to the list in the UK behest, and the UN has rarely served that purpose, but it occasionally gave Moscow and Washington a space to help ease crises during the Cold War, sometimes at the expense of London and Paris. During the Cold War, Eisenhower administration aligned with Russia at the UN to pressure the UK and France to end their 1956 intervention in the Suez Crisis. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and Now, as the Cold War ended, the Soviets and the United States turned to the UN peacekeepers and mediators to help untangle their proxy wars in the so-called Third World. As recently as 2012, the Obama administration in Russia lowered the risk of confrontation over the Syrian regime use of weapons. And in the recent years, experts on the Security Council have fretted that decision makers in both Washington and Moscow have forgotten the body's value as a safety valve in moments of crisis. As Bruce Jones of Brookings Institute noted in a paper last year, the post-Cold War generation of diplomats and UN watchers have tended to forget how it can provide a guardrail against great power escalation. Now, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the permanent members of the Security Council have continued to work together grudgingly on other files, although Russia has been increasingly willing to use a veto over issues like monitoring sanctions on North Korea, but nobody has turned it to as a platform for serious de-escalation. Now, most states will not take such a benign view of it. Administration tries to railroad some of its other priorities, such as ideas for taking over Gaza through the Security Council. Last week's spat over Ukraine may only be a prelude to much greater rows over Israel and the Palestinians at the UN, and thoughtful diplomats see Washington's willingness to dump some of the basic principles of international law, like territorial integrity and non-aggressiveness, when referring to Ukraine as a worrying sign about how it will address other crises. There's ultimately a difference between the big powers using the Security Council as a space for short-term signaling over crises, which is all the United States did last week, and treated the UN as a framework for substantial peacemaking. For the global organization to serve as the latter function, it's necessary to take at least some of its guiding principles seriously and try to involve broader coalitions of states in real diplomacy. It's not clear whether the Trump administration sees the UN as anything more than somewhere to rubber stamp its bilateral diplomacy with Moscow. Even a very cynical reading of the UN's founding purpose suggests it should aim for more than that. And this is from Foreign Policy on DNYUZ. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.